Welcome back. This is week 6, lecture 1, The Impact of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution. This is the first lecture after the midterm. So if you're watching this, I'm assuming that most of you anyway who are watching this have already submitted your first midterm. Um, and if you haven't already received my feedback on that, you will very shortly. And so you have an idea of what's expected. And keep in mind, too, please, that the way the course is structured, the midterms are designed as kind of preparing for the final, which is in some ways the all important exam. Anyway, I'll talk more about that um, later, not in this lecture, but in later lectures. I've addressed that in the introduction to the course document. And of course, for the second midterm, which is the next task that you really face, I'll be addressing that as well. That being said, we've been looking through about the development of early modern Europe up to the eve of the French Revolution, because that's really the kind of swinging door, so to speak, between early modern and modern European history or Western civilization in that sense. Now, this period is one, in some ways, we could call the Age of Revolutions, because we have the American Revolution, the French Revolution, we have the Industrial Revolution, and on we go. And so we can kind of see that something is really happening in Europe, because revolution is a very strong word. And the American Revolution is the first of all the revolutions in terms of that. Of course, we have the scientific revolution, so called, but one of the questions is, was that really a revolution? We have the Reformation, sometimes has been termed a revolution, but the question is that really a revolution? There's a little question that, in so many ways, the American Revolution really was a revolution, because it is a group of colonies that revolts against their mother country, Britain, and establishes a new country. So there's a real revolution of government, and then also society and culture and everything else. And we'll talk more about that as we go along today in terms of what that really means. So often we approach the American Revolution from the American side of things. Um, I'm sure that you've were taught the American Revolution in elementary school and probably again in high school, maybe already again in college if you've taken one of the U.S. history surveys, 105 or 106, um, or even special courses in the American Revolution. But the approach I want to take here is trying to put it in that broader European context, because a lot was going on. And so, in many ways, I would argue that we really can't understand the American Revolution without seeing it as part of European context and the impact that the Enlightenment actually had on politics and society and theories of government and everything else. So that's what I hope to kind of to achieve today, and the focus will be on the Declaration of Independence, because that is in some ways, a defining document in terms of the revolution, the Declaration of Independence from Britain. Now I have up here the first slide. What is it here? It's the myth to history. And that's really getting at what this document is starting in the present. And I'm drawing a lot of this. Again, this is not my uh, area of expertise or research. So I'm drawing from other scholars primarily, and my own perspectives. I mean, I've taught the Declaration in my courses before, certainly, and I'll talk more about that as we go through today. But it's Pauline Maier, which is up there, American Scripture, is a book, the book title. I forget the subtitle. Um, it's a fantastic book. I've assigned it before in other classes. I've assigned it especially, I think, in my history H217, the nature of history course. I thought about assigning it here too and having you write a book review, but I thought, no, 2 midterms and a final is enough. But I would encourage you to read it. And what Pauline Maier did in that book was to really analyze the document itself. She said, as a colonial American historian, she had taught the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War and everything else, but she had never really seen it. And so she thought she should actually go to Washington to see the actual document. And she goes to the National Archives, and there in the rotunda of the National Archives, which is this large neo-Gothic building with columns and everything else, there are 3 documents displayed in very secure glass cases with, what all the needed accoutrements for preserving them and keeping them safe. So it's not just behind a plate of glass that anyone could break. I don't think it could be. I'm sure it's bulletproof and everything else. But it's the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. In some ways, these three documents form what America was, at least at the beginning. And what she says is it's up there, it's displayed, it's almost like an altar with the backdrop and everything else. It's like you're entering a church. And there's this reverence to it. It has become this holy document. And holy, sanctus or sancta for the feminine, that really what it means, set apart. And this is definitely a document that's been set apart and is revered. And what she does is go from this myth of this document, both in terms of the document itself as well as its role and function in our society and in our understanding, to try to get back to the history of the document as it was originally formed and composed. And it's a fascinating story. And some of that is what I am relating to you today. Obviously, there's a lot more in her book, so please, I would really encourage you to look at it. But when we look at this document, it has become a symbol. It's not just a text. It is a symbol of what America was all about in terms of its founding. And that symbol is very different from the sign that symbolizes the symbol. And so this document is no longer just a text, a document, a written piece of work. It has become a symbol whereby the document symbolizes something greater: American independence, American freedom, American equality, given the opening lines, and everything else, which is not necessarily the same as the document itself or its original composition or construction, as I'll talk about shortly too. And so here we have the issue of the distinction between argument and meaning, because what is the meaning of the document? Symbols have meaning and have much more meaning than do that which the signs that symbolize them. And so when we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, we need to understand, are we talking about the symbol or are we talking about the text? Because an argument can only be based on evidence, as I think I've said before. And what is the evidence? The symbol is not what the evidence is. The symbol is the document. Now, the symbol can serve as evidence if we want to. That's what she does in her book in terms of arguing for the symbolic meaning of the Declaration. But that's distinct from the meaning of the text itself in its original setting and context. And it can be very difficult to make that distinction. But as historians, that's what we're supposed to do, because all of a sudden we start attributing all this meaning and symbolism to a very almost mundane thing. So I have it there, the hammer blow of history, because that's a phrase taken from Friedrich Nietzsche. So it's not Pauline Maier, but what Nietzsche says is history is the basis to critique all this meaning that is added onto things. And so in some ways, the historian has to come back and say, yes, but how do we interpret this document? Or do we interpret it based on the thing itself, the actual text, as it was originally constructed? Or do we interpret it as its meaning for us today? And that is a very important question, especially, for example, dealing with constitutional law, dealing with the issue of human rights, etc., etc. And it's very problematic. When Jefferson wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What did he mean by that? And what do we mean by it? Did he mean all individuals when he says all men? Did he mean all human beings? Obviously not. Jefferson owned slaves. Slavery was very prevalent at the time. Did he mean women and children too? No. They were property, as were slaves. he meant free white males who were property owners. So it becomes to be an issue of how do we understand this document and what type of arguments can we base on it. That is the point here. So we need to analyze it. Now, the Declaration of Independence is one of the texts for your readings for this week. I think it's probably very likely, if not probable, that most of you, if not all of you, have read it before, at least in bits and pieces. But I really want you to read it as a text, to say, okay, what does this document say? And to read the whole thing. And the link to that text that I give on Canvas is to the website of the National Archive. And there you will see a transcription of the text. And that's what you were to read, basically. And then you also see an image of the original document. And you can see kind of the difference, the difficulty in this kind of yellowed, faded, written piece of document. And then the transcription. And just that is one problem that historians have, is making sure that we can actually read the document correctly, knowing what it says there. And it's a great website with a lot of other information. So please feel free, not only reading the document, but using that website to help in your analysis of the text itself, which is the point of the assignment and assigning it for you to read. That being said, then, how did we get there? What does it really mean? And how do we understand the background to the Declaration of Independence as it was originally formulated, which was in the context of emerging tensions between the colonies and Britain before the Revolution, before anyone knew how it was going to come about, and to understand how that was going to play out, or at least to understand what was going on in the colonies, we need to go back to see the impact of the Glorious Revolution. Now, the Glorious Revolution, as we talked about before the midterm, as you read about in the textbook before the midterm, was an event that took place in 1688, is when they got rid of Charles II, I believe it is. I can't remember right now off the top of my head. I'm sorry. And brought in William and Mary. There was no bloodshed. It's called the Bloodless Revolution as well. That's why it was called the Glorious Revolution. They just replaced one monarch, deposed the monarch, and brought in a new one. And they did so based on the assertion of rights. As we've already talked about, as you've been reading about, the English Bill of Rights, and this assertion that the monarch cannot impose upon the rights of the aristocracy, the nobility, which really goes back to the Magna Carta in that sense. But again, we're not talking about all people. We're talking about the nobility, the aristocracy, the white propertied males, basically. And a couple of the primary rights that are expressed in the English Bill of Rights, which they made William sign and agreed to, was no taxation without representation, and the right not to be told that they have to house soldiers, so that the government just couldn't come in and say, here, you have to support these soldiers, and without consent. It was all about consent, the consent of the governed. That's what the English Bill of Rights was about. And we see those same principles behind the Declaration of Independence and behind the U.S. Bill of Rights as well. Now, what was going on here was this tension between Crown and Parliament. Because as Simon Schama, who's a great British historian, he was at Harvard for a while. I'm not sure where he ended up in his career. And Schama is one of these people that kind of a bit controversial because he wrote a lot, and he wrote these big, fat, thick books. He wrote a book on the Dutch. It's called The Embarrassment of Riches. And that really upset the Dutch because he revealed things about Dutch culture that they really didn't want to be revealed, or weren't necessarily were aware of themselves. And so they would be nitpicky. So if you got a location slightly wrong, they say, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But it was a brilliant book, or it is a brilliant book. He also wrote one about the French Revolution. He has a whole series and video series on the history of art, which is brilliant. And he has a major 4-volume or 5-volume study also on video on the history of Britain. And that's another thing I almost thought about doing, is simply showing his episode with him narrating, and he's British. He has a wonderful British sense of humor and wit and precision. He's an excellent showman or presenter, so to speak. And the episode I had in mind explicitly was called "The Wrong War," and how Britain kind of got itself into this mess with the colonies, and how did that come about? Because the colonies, keep in mind, we're not like, proto Americans who are being oppressed by the English. These are British citizens who are in the colonies, who consider themselves British citizens. They try to make their lives as much as British as possible with their tea and everything else. And there were arguments over how the crown should relate to the citizens in the colonies. And at one point, as that Sharma brings up, there's a big debate in Parliament, and there was some factions of Parliament that were feeling that the colonies were being uppity and demanding things that they shouldn't, demand. And they were saying, when did these people, think that they were actually free? They were colonies. When did they, when did they think they were free, independent states? And I believe it was William Penn, who we know from American Revolution English history, but he was an Englishman in Parliament, and he said, the question I want to ask, the gentleman says, when were they become free? So when I want to ask, when did they ever become enslaved? And that puts it in very different context. There was debate in Parliament over the Crown's treatment of the colonies. Now, it was a real problem. Anyway, Britain was on kind of hard times financially because of all the wars that they were involved in. And that brings me back then to the context, in some ways, of the entire American Revolution. These good English citizens having kind of, been the inheritors of the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights, sitting here in the colonies, and then feeling that those rights that had been promised them by the crown, by William, had been now impinged upon and denied and not recognized. The government, the crown, George III, is like, yeah, but you know what? This is costing us tons of money. The colonies are supposed to enrich the mother country. That's the whole idea of colonialism. We're supposed to be gaining money, but we're not. We're losing money right and left. They should at least pay some of their fair share. Ergo, the taxations, the Stamp Act, Paper Act, tea, etc., which led to this cry of no taxation without representation, which was the same cry in 1688. And why was it so expensive? Well, what was going on at the time was something that is known in European history as the 7 Years' War, or in American history as the French and Indian War. And if you've studied the American Revolution, you probably have heard of the French Indian War, but I don't think it probably has been given much attention. That's maybe based on my own memory and my own background. But here we have from opposition and protest to revolution, because it's a big thing to go from opposing the government to being critical of the government, and then to declaring independence and fighting against the government. That's a huge shift from protest to revolution, opposition, first opposition, then protest, and then revolution. So we have these British colonies, and there are wars going on in Europe, and there are wars going on in the New World between primarily France and Britain. France had colonies too, especially in Canada in the north, and Britain had colonies. And both countries really, there's some in Spain too. And so Spain is kind of involved as well. And this 7 Years' War in Europe, that was not only France and England and Spain, also got into Germany and Austria. It's called the War of the Austrian Succession was going on. So there's almost all of Europe was kind of at war. And this part that, from the American side of things, we call the French Indian War, was part of this larger kind of European conflict. And the conflict, France and England have been fighting each other all the way back to the not early Middle Ages, but high Middle Ages, at least from the 12th century on. and they were still fighting each other. And it's just now that's being played out in the colonies. And I have up there a map, if you go to the next slide, a map of just the holdings and what you will see there. We have, the holdings of France, that's in the kind of the red. Um, that's, no, that's the, oh my gosh, you have the British colonies in the red, you have the uh, French claims in the blue, and then you have also up in the Hudson Bay some other English. And so they're disputed territories between the English and the French. You see up there Louisiana. This is before the Louisiana Purchase. And so then you see the Spanish there down in Florida. And so you can see just by the map how conflictual it was, especially if one side or the other are looking to spread and expand. They didn't really know necessarily how vast this North American continent was or is, but they knew they had a lot of land out there, and so let's claim it before someone else can. So you have France fighting, trying to expand. You have British fighting and trying to expand, and they are both trying to get the Native Americans on their side to fight for them because the Native Americans know the territory so much, and the Native Americans, consisting of various tribes, which are not all friendly, it's not one thing, all Native Americans sitting around, smoking the peace pipe saying, oh, cool. They are more pacifistic Native American tribes, and there's more bellicose Native American tribes. There are two in tension. But before the Europeans came, those tensions were minimal. But especially when the pressure is being put on them from outside, from invaders coming in, Europeans coming in, the Native Americans are getting squished and tense. Their land's being taken away from them. So what are they going to do? They're going to try to take more. It gets to be a horrible situation. So that is the kind of this context with the French and the English battling. And then you know what? It's one thing when the French are fighting the English in Europe. Crossing the Channel is not that big of a deal. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean is huge. So all of a sudden, the costs of war fighting in North America, fighting the French in North America, is huge. And so somehow the British Crown is just spending and spending and spending, trying to make claims on this new territory. And the French are trying to do, in some ways, the same thing and trying to enlist the Native American populations on both sides. And it becomes a problem, a real problem. And the crown, the British crown, is being financially squeezed. That is the basis for the position of we need to tax the colonies. They're supposed to enrich the mother country, not cost us previously unseen amounts of money to protect them, British citizens, protect them from the French, from the Native Americans, even though the English had Native Americans fighting for them too. The French were a bit more successful, actually, in gaining the support of Native American tribes. And so it's like they need to pay their way. The taxes, etc., etc., etc. And that then those taxes that were imposed as a way to extract revenue from the colonies to help pay for the war that was going on was seen by the British colonies, the British who were in the colonies, because that's how they viewed themselves, as contravening the rights of the English Bill of Rights. And all of a sudden it's like, how can you do that? No taxation without representation. That's tyranny. That is imposing on us our rights as British citizens. That's the conflict. What do we do about it? How do we go from there? So that is then where we find beginnings of outbreak. And we find the immediate context of the final decision to declare independence. Now here we have the Declaration of Independence. I have up there from Locke to Jefferson. Because not only do we have the English Bill of Rights, we also have John Locke, who we talked about before the midterm, and the first articulation we have of inherent human rights of life, liberty, and property, which then Jefferson turned into life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Jefferson knew Locke very well. These were all men who were products of, students of, participants in the Enlightenment. These were enlightened thinkers. Without making comments about the contemporary situation, and so the idea that the founding fathers, Jefferson and the others, Ben Franklin too, especially, and a week ago, were good conservative Christians is completely ahistorical. It's part of that myth, just like the myth of the Declaration itself. These were enlightened people. When Jefferson writes that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator, that's the creator of theism. They were theistic, and just because they mention their creator doesn't mean they're good conservative Christians or any other type of Christians. They're probably nominally Christians, somewhat, in terms of their own beliefs. Benjamin Franklin spent a lot of time in Paris and in France. The height of the Enlightenment, Jefferson, I think, had been in France too for a bit. And these were very well educated and sophisticated thinkers, steeped in Enlightenment thought, Enlightenment doctrine. And that's where we get the original American ideals, out of this Enlightenment context. And there were, still debate going on. There were within the colonies several different factions. There were the faction of, well, yes, it's not right. We really don't like it, but we are, loyal to Britain. We're British citizens. We'll follow the king, even if we have problems with him. There was the faction of, we need to change this one way or the other. And then there was the radical faction of, we have to declare our independence from Britain. Now, I point that out because it was by no means clear, let's say in 1774, 1773, that independence would be declared. The radicals ended up winning after a lot of the events of the revolution that you study, and we have studied, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington Concord, all these things, the Stamp Act, all the events that took place that led to the Declaration of Independence. Now, in the context of this French Indian War, as part of the 7 Years' War, the radicals were able to convince many of the colonies to go along with it when things had gotten so bad that we really have to separate. Rapprochement is not possible. And that is a huge step to make. You say, well, maybe it wasn't all that huge from the radicals who were leading the Boston Tea Party and all that. But for your, let's say, average colonist who's an average British citizen just living in the colonies, and there were British citizens living in all the British colonies around the world. In India, there was a large British population in India. And they didn't call for a revolution. But these Americans, because of the French and English wars, on the North American continent and the added expense, it's a different situation. And then how do you go about doing so? How do you go about declaring your independence? And there are newspapers, there are presses to publish books and pamphlets and newspapers and things. And the spread of information was very important. Now, for the crown, for George III, he thought they don't read even really, those ignorant people out in the colonies. Whereas other factions of Parliament was saying, yes, they do. These are educated British citizens. Now, were there uneducated British citizens there? Of course. But there was a group of well-educated British intellectuals who were in the colonies. How do we go about bringing all 13 colonies together to declare independence? How do we construct a document that will work? Can we really declare our independence? And the declaring of independence was a series of stages. We have 1776, July 4th. We all know that date, which is, as Polymer argues, is not really historically accurate that much at all, because it's certainly not when it was signed into quote unquote law. The Declaration wasn't signed until a week or so later. All signed, but it was presented and adopted. But before that, there were other declarations by other individual colonies, and the whole point was, it's not going to work unless we're all working together. Another interesting thing is that Polymer does is go through the various drafts of the Declaration, because Jefferson was the primary author, but it was edited and revised in Congress, in the Continental Congress. And interestingly enough, and drawing on some of these other individual colonies' declarations and things, the original draft by Jefferson included amongst the crimes that Georgia committed a lot about slavery. It damned George III for the slave trade and everything else. And this may say it's kind of hypocritical if since Jefferson himself owned slaves. But those parts were edited out. And Polymer, if you do get her book, in an appendix, she has a transcription of the final document. Then she also has a number of transcriptions, or what's called diplomatic editions of the edited versions. You'll see large paragraphs condemning George III for the slave trade were removed. And why? That was a concession to the southern states, where slavery was seen as essential to the economy. So to get the southern southern colonies to go along with this common declaration, which was a very arduous political process, they had all 13 colonies to agree on one document. They edited out everything else about slavery, which also lends an important or requires I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time coming up with the right word now, which sheds important light on, again, Jefferson's preface in terms of all men being created equal, because even though he had wanted to damn George III for slavery, he certainly didn't mean the slaves, and he went along with it all being edited out, so we don't even mention slavery. That was what's going on in this document that finally was crafted and set and agreed upon and ratified. And then it's still, do we go ahead and issue it? And that was the final step. Yes, let's do it. When things got so bad that when push comes to shove, when there's no other option that we can see, revolution is it. And we sign it, and as John Hancock famously said, I'm going to write my name and sign this so big that so large I want George III to know exactly that I'm signing this. That's where you get the name. Put your John Hancock on this, your own signature. Just think for a moment the step that would take. And here again, I will dare to talk about the current political situation. Not to support one side or the other, or whatever, this division within the country. But to say, there's talk of civil war. There's talk of civil war. Far more from the right than from the left, but the left too. If Trump were to win in November and do a lot of the things that he says he's planning on doing and going to do, what would the left do? What would the majority of the population do who don't support Trump? If Trump does not win, if he's convicted and is put in jail, what are his supporters going to do? And that's when we have already a lot of fierce talk about civil war. and violence and upheaval. What does it take? Is that just talk and threats? Or what would it take for you, and here I'm addressing each one of you, to take up arms to rebel and fight against the government? It's one thing to go out and protest. That's an American right from the beginning almost. Protest. Preferably do it peacefully. Don't destroy property. Don't use violence. That's kind of crossing the line. But protesting, that's an American right. Freedom of speech. Killing people or destroying property, those are crimes. But protesting is freedom of speech. But when does protest come to rebellion, that comes to revolution? The reason I say that is we, as Americans, those of you who are Americans, and those of you who may not be but are here from somewhere else, but this is kind of our heritage and tradition. We look back on American history and the Revolution as this glorious event, how great it was. The Star Spangled Banner, of course, that's about the War of 1812, not the Revolution, but it is often seen as that. George Washington, all the myths that have emerged about the American Revolution because they won. They gained their freedom. They're freedom fighters, fighting for right, for God, and for country. They weren't fighting for God at all. They weren't fighting for country because a country did not exist. They were fighting to establish a country independent from Britain. How do we go about doing that? How do we go about doing that? And what would it take? How far do we have to go? It's a hugely important existential question. And I'm not trying to say this because I think that's where our country is headed. We may or we may not be. That's not why I'm asking that. But the tensions have gotten so big, and the talk already is about that. I just want to make this an existential analogy to going back to 1774, 75, the first few 6 months of 1776. What would make you take up arms to fight the government for independence? It's a huge deal. And then the problem is, now what? Now I have up there the French factor. It's because these colonists, even with George Washington, and he was a great general. Valley Forge is infamous, but he was maybe not as great as myth has made him out to be, but he was good. But the French help the Americans. The French, General Lafayette, came to fight for the Americans. Statue of Liberty actually then was given to the Americans after by the French after the revolution of things. And why were the French so important supporting the Americans? Oh my God, they see this great. We've been fighting the damn English. If we can get the colonies to revolt, it's all about politics and power. It wasn't necessarily because the French read the Declaration of Independence and were moved in their hearts to tears based on the ideals of these underdog colonists uprising. There was more like, this is an opportunity for us. And the thing is, it worked. Not all that long after, then the French kind of gives colonists a little bit of wayside freedom, and they're not trying to take over. And it's okay, we can work with the colonists. Louisiana Purchase comes through, and the rest is history, so to speak. But still, there's a huge French presence in Canada, and on we can go. So that was going there. The French, would the colonists have been able to win without the French? I would say, I bet not. Obviously, we can't go back and rerun it. But that is how important the French were to the military efforts of the colonists. Why were they doing that? Because of their ongoing fight with the English. Again, you can't understand the American Revolution without understanding the 7 Years' War within the European context. So that's why this is so important to world, Western civilization. It's not just U.S. civilization. It's Western civilization, and how, in some ways, how the North American continent became westernized. Because before the colonists, we can't really call it a Western culture. We have various, numerous cultures of Native American peoples. And what happens, we have European invaders who come in, settle, and increasingly push the Native Americans out. And they're fighting amongst themselves over this territory. Conquest. This is part of human civilization as such. It's been going on since the very beginning of civilization, even before civilization became Western civilization. And is there any inherent right to territories? I'd say absolutely not, because everybody is an invader, and we have migrations and everything else. Go back to Rome and everything else. It gets very messed up. And we need to see the American Revolution in that context. That's why I wanted to focus on that. Now, we won. We won. The British colonists won. And now what? It's like we have to now govern ourselves. What form of government are we going to have? We're going to have a constitution. We're going to have a written constitution, which kind of is a big deal. The Roman Constitution, the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables were a series of laws. They were written down, but the Constitution was more just tradition. In England, there's the Magna Carta, but that's not the Constitution. There's the English Bill of Rights. That's not the Constitution. There's no English Constitution. There is the tradition that constitutes the country, the nation. What are we going to do? How are we going to go about it? And somehow, by having a document, just like the Declaration, by having a document, we will be a nation of law, not of ethnicity. Already we're pretty diverse. We're not just Londoners who've all come over to the colonies. We're from various places. We have the French, we have the Native Americans. We have to deal with somehow. We will be a nation of law, and the Constitution will be the foundation of that law. And the founders of the Constitution studied Roman law, studied European law, British law, all the way through the Western tradition to establish a constitution. And their first attempt didn't work very well. So they got rid of it after a couple of years and went back to work and came up with a constitution that is a document that we have, that is there with the Declaration of Independence, the National Archives, and the Rotunda as a holy document. And appended to that constitution, then they came up with their own Bill of Rights. The three foundational documents of the United States. In some ways, that is unique. In some ways, it's similar to the so-called religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which are all based on a text. How that text then is interpreted is problematic. But at least there is a basis for it. It's not based on memory. It's not based on tradition. It's not based on some sense of monarchy. It's based on a text. And we have three texts. The question is, how do we understand those texts? What do we make of them, and how do we apply those texts to society as it continues in culture, and as it changes and goes on and on and on? That is the problem. A new nation is born. Great. Now what? What is the cost of revolution? And here I'm not talking about financial cost. I'm not talking about the cost of lives, people who die for it. I'm talking about the cost of all of a sudden having to say, we have to govern ourselves. That's scary. How do we do it? Scholars often refer to as the American experiment. It is an experiment. It's an experiment that has lasted pretty well in terms of the Constitution, forms of government. How long will it last? That's the question. And what would come afterwards? Now, those are the questions I want to leave you with. But my point being is these questions are simply part of the Western tradition. Coming out of the Enlightenment, a sense of freedom, sense of liberty, of inherent human rights that need to be protected. That view of Locke, unlike Hobbes, a view of Locke, that the function of government is to ensure and uphold the rights of its citizens. And when the government doesn't do that, the citizens have the right to dissolve the government and form a new one that will uphold those rights. Which means what those rights are pretty important. I think I mentioned human rights could be revolutionary. Oh, yes. What are the human rights that you would be willing to overthrow the government for? To take up arms and fight the government for? To establish a new government? So often, intellectual history is seen as just a bunch of people sitting back with these ideas, with philosophy, with theology, whatever. It doesn't really have any real impact. Well, the American Revolution undercuts that argument completely because it was the ideals of the Enlightenment put into practice. And it had a major impact on the further development of Western civilization. And it was to have an impact, too, on France, because shortly after the American Revolution, we have the French Revolution, based on the same ideals, the same principles, also based on the ideals of the Enlightenment. And that's what we'll be talking about next lecture. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.